In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Crit Room Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan, and just Ryan today. Albert is actually out for a family event, so I am solo omitting this podcast, but it's okay because we have a fantastic guest on today that we're going to have a great conversation with. Today, we actually have the lovely Maria. How do you pronounce your last name? Is it Ulashchenko?
It's okay. Maria Ulashchenko.
Maria Ulashchenko. Okay, I didn't butcher it too badly, I hope. But today we have a lot of great topics planned ahead. First of all, we're going to sit down with Maria and get to know her, figure out what she's about and what she's doing in the world right now. Also, we're going to talk more about the kind of a pretty popular point I've seen across the architecture community so far today, but it's about the aesthetics in architecture and public opinion versus architect opinion on things, and even a bonus idea at the end, so stick around. But anyways, let's not spend any more time and let's just jump right into it. All right, so Maria, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing great. I'm actually really excited for this episode. This has been on my mind for quite a while. I've been wanting to talk about this for so long, but I just haven't had the mental bullet points in my brain about what specifically I wanted to talk about. So I'm glad that we got to set up this episode because we finally got a pretty good list of things to talk about today, I think.
No, me too. We have a lot to cover, a lot of very interesting stuff.
Yes. Okay, so also, this is our second episode, actually, of Architecturally Speaking. And funny enough, both guests in a row have been from Germany, which was not planned, but that was kind of a funny coincidence.
Oh, yeah. I remember.
And a part of the Architecturally Speaking series is we like to ask questions about our guests' hottest takes on architecture news or projects in the world. And since you are our guest for this week, we wanted to ask you specifically, what is your most controversial architecture project in the world, in your opinion, and why?
So there's definitely a lot of architecture projects currently that are viewed as controversial by a lot of different people. But to me, the most controversial projects are those that are extensions builds of kind of old historic buildings or base on them, and then in turn kind of manipulate the history or have something to do with that, which is kind of interesting to me because I'm a little bit of a history nerd, as you will tell probably. So the controversial projects that I actually remember the most is the Humboldt Forum here in Berlin. So we have this thing called the Museum Island, which is kind of an island with all the main museums. There's the Old Museum, the New Museum, the James Simon Gallery designed by David Chipperfield.
That's pretty awesome, actually.
Yeah, it is. It's really cool. And then we also have a little forum there, which was designed back in Prussia in the 17th century. And recently, in 2020, they opened an extension built to it, an extension that was designed in 2018 by an architect. And it's a little bit controversial. So the architect is Franco Stella. And he designed the building that was opened in 2020. And basically the big controversy was that the old Humboldt Forum was kind of a symbol of culture for Prussia and what it meant. And then it was, when it was demolished in World War II, and basically like most of Berlin, people were kind of wondering whether it was necessary to rebuild that historical center or whether it was really necessary to kind of reimagine that culture that we had back then anew. And also the architect, the poor guy was tasked with designing a facade that was representative of not only the old history of the building, but also kind of the new facades in the area. So like the James Simon Gallery. And what kind of happened is the part of the building that he designed just became kind of like a concrete block with windows. And those became part of the old historic building and the old historic part of the Humboldt Forum. And a lot of people were not pleased about that. And I think that's kind of the controversial building.
Nobody likes the concrete block, yeah.
Yeah, and especially in combination with the old historical part of the building that wasn't demolished, that was renewed. Initially, the whole plan was to renew the whole building, but then somehow in 2018 they were like, no, let us kind of change it up and create a whole new part of the forum. And that's when Stella kind of came about, and he was just a young architect from Venice, so he wasn't really known when he just got this project. And I believe he definitely didn't anticipate the kind of task he took upon himself. Uh, so yeah, there was a long story about my controversial project.
No, that's great. I mean, that also tees us up pretty well for the topic of today's episode. But first, so we were talking just a little bit before we hit record, and we discovered that you are actually a second year in architecture, right?
Yes, I am.
And that to me is incredible. I mean, Albert and I were talking about this too, but we were just saying like, wow, she like the work that she's putting out is better than some of the third years that we used to know back in the days. So this is like very talented, and we're glad to have you here to talk about a lot of these things. But also, you said it yourself that you are kind of more of like an architecture history buff.
Yes, that's kind of how I got my love for architecture and why I decided to study it initially.
So yeah, can you go into that just a little bit? Like, what made you? Was it the love for history, and then you just also happened to love architecture, so both of those came together, or was it you found architecture first and just started to love the history of how it came to be, or how did you figure this part out? How did you get to your niche?
Yeah, so I actually wrote about this in my college application letter, surprisingly. So someone
Oh
liked my
wow.
story. But so I grew up in St. Petersburg, which is a city in Russia, and it has a very big historical center that wasn't demolished or changed or anything. So they really maintained the historical buildings from the 17th century, the 18th century. And I just remember as a child, I was always walking around and I didn't even really understand what I was looking at, but I just knew that I really liked the buildings that were around me. And then I also went to art school when I was back here. And we used to draw a lot of buildings and just take a lot of inspiration from ornaments on buildings, kind of draw the sculptures that we saw on buildings. And I believe that's where I really started to love architecture because to me it was art that people could also live in. And I just think that's so beautiful. It's like it's the
Yeah.
most meaningful art we can make. That's kind of my story, I
Yeah.
guess.
No, I love that. I also came about architecture in a similar way, about the whole occupying art in a way, where it's just there's so many beautiful things around you, and the fact that you get to live in those every single day and just have like an attachment to something that's real and tangible in front of you is really awesome. And like just livable sculpture is another way I've heard some people say it, and I
Yes.
love that. And although I was never really much of like a history person, funny enough, I just it took architecture to actually value a lot of the history and just how things have come to be. The whole idea is we had some tutor slash mentored like figure back in our third year with Professor It's Different. He would tell us a lot of things that, or a lot of philosophies that have influenced how Albert and I think about things. But it was this idea of standing on the shoulders of people who have come before you. So that obviously ties deeply with history. And, whatever we have an architecture style today, which we're about to get into, but whatever kind of architecture history that exists before it is how we've come up with the architecture style today. Even though there's such a weird disconnect, like if you look at a glass skyscraper today, you're not going to tie it back to the pyramids all the way back in the days. But somehow in the way, there's a big old transition that shows you how that thing has happened. So that part got pretty fascinating to me.
Yeah, definitely. The whole evolution
But
of architecture styles, once you get into it, it's super interesting.
yeah, who knew, right? And then, so another question. Okay, serious question: Rhino or SketchUp?
Rhino, 100%. I love
Here we go.
Rhino.
Right?
I'm a
Yes.
Rhino girly
I
through and through.
yes.
What about you?
We were interested, or Albert and I were placing bets earlier. We're like, I wonder if she's just going to say AutoCAD instead. But yeah, no, Rhino all the way.
I'm not that kind of person.
Yeah,
Definitely
I
Rhino.
for my job, we our office is split 50-50 of a certain schools, like K State versus KU, and it seems like a lot of KU people use SketchUp primarily, but K State uses Rhino primarily. So when we were jumping onto projects and I was joining a project team, they were used to using SketchUp for everything. So this was like I had barely even touched SketchUp at that point. I hardly knew anything about it outside of just drawing certain things. But this, like the logic between the two is just so completely different that it gets very frustrating to use SketchUp when you're used to just Rhino being such a neat little program just to create geometry and stuff. Like if you were to try and draw a box, right? It'd be super easy to do in either program, really. But let's take like Rhino, right? You draw a box, you extrude it, boom. Now you have a box, you can just click on it and drag it wherever you want it. But if you have SketchUp and you're trying to create a box, you can draw all your 6 planes of it that you need, but now you have to group that thing. I didn't know that's how that worked. So there's just like these extra steps to everything, a bunch of different plugins that you had to have for everything to work. And yeah, it was just, it kind of became a nightmare to learn all that so quickly. But
No, totally. I had to use SketchUp for a job that I had previously, and it was definitely an interesting couple of months I had to experience of really getting back into it, of having to group all this stuff and create the different planes. And I remember I had to do a landscape plan in SketchUp and then create some detailed drawings out of it. And it was a whole thing that I wish I could have done in Rhino. But yeah, it's a different program.
okay, and then another quick question before I move on to the next thing is, what's your favorite studio project? Now understanding that you're a second year and you have 4 semesters to pull from, but
So we kind of have. I'm actually in my fourth semester right now, so I've only done 3 projects for school. But I would say the last project we did, which
oh,
was the urbanism project, where we had to create a development in the area of Charlottenburg, which is a district of Berlin, the city we live in. And we had to pick a generation of people that we would help with our architecture. And we picked the elderly community. And that project was just so beautiful to me because we got to interview a lot of old people and really understand what kind of needs they have, and then create a whole plan on how to create spaces for them where they can interact and not be lonely and have a good life quality at the end of their days. It was it was a very good project.
no, yeah, that's pretty exciting. I had a project not too, or fairly similar to that actually. It was a competition project, mind you, but the idea was to create this micro house. So a part of that was I was trying to combine a couple different things because with most of my projects, I try to see if there's a way to add an additional layer to every brief that we're given, just to add like either a little bit more of a challenge if it's a little too basic of a thing, or just give myself a couple other rules so I can force myself to try and look at a problem a certain way. But one of the things with it is it was just a micro house, and the only rules, it was like a certain square footage that you had to maintain, and you had to allow it to be movable. But when I was doing the research for all that, and in the class that I was in, we were understanding that there was a lot of in the United States, there's this concept of ADUs, basically having smaller houses in the backyards of other people's primary houses. So part of me put together an idea of like, oh, in a lot of different countries, there's this stress of trying to keep multiple generations of the same family in very close quarters, like sometimes under the same roof. So it's kind of weird that America has a cultural understanding, I guess, if you will, or just a agreed upon cultural idea that they take their grandparents and they put them into retirement homes. Like they're so far away from the main family. And like that seems kind of backwards from a lot of how other countries do it. I wonder if there's a way to try and mirror a lot of those cultural qualities. So then using the ADUs, like having the house in the backyard, I'm like, oh, I wonder if this could be an opportunity for that. So going back to what you're saying about preventing elderly from feeling lonely and everything, especially when it comes to their family, I thought, oh, that'd be such a great idea to just have like a smaller house for the grandparents to live in. And, the larger house could be for the main family with their kids to live in. But then everyone has their independence because they're not living in the same roof to drive themselves crazy, but they can share the backyard and they can see their family as often as they want to. So yeah, that's cool. I liked that project of yours quite a bit. And you want to know word for that, right?
Uh, no, I don't think I did. I don't think I did.
Oh, sorry. I remember seeing something on Instagram where I thought
Oh,
some
well,
page had
it got
highlighted your project for
reposted
something.
I think it's nominated for like a student award thing, but I don't think we won
Okay,
yet.
nominated for it. Okay.
Yes, not yet.
Great. See, this
Hopefully.
is what I get for only reading the headlines.
No, it's okay.
Okay. So then the last question before moving into our topic for today is, unsurprisingly, you have a platform on Instagram where people can go and follow you, and we'll talk about that at the end of the episode for sure too. But I wanted to ask you, what is your either A, if you have a specific mission and goal for your platform, what is that? And two, do you have any bigger plans for what you want to do with your Instagram page?
That's a very interesting question because I'm actually about to kind of start a new series on my Instagram and just my social media in general that maybe I can talk a little bit about. But my whole mission
Of
with
course.
my social media in general is to make other people be interested in something that consumes my life as a whole. Like to me, architecture is everything, and I'm just so passionate about it. And I feel like
Hmm.
other people, as soon as I talk to them about architecture and I talk to them about the history of buildings and some projects I did, a lot of people become very interested in it. And it's such an underappreciated art, in my opinion. And architects are such underappreciated artists that every time I can interest someone in our skills or in something that we do, I just feel very happy. And to me, that's actually the most important goal. I just want to make architecture cool again, I guess.
I love that. Make architecture cool again. No, I love that. That's I've also feel very strongly about that topic. And I
Mhm.
remember when we were just having the early conversations about setting up this episode, that was one of those things that I was wanting to talk to you about in this
Mhm.
episode at some point too. But
Yeah.
yeah, it is kind of strange that architecture is literally around every single person in a city or just society, and it gets so under appreciated or just
Mhm.
under misunderstood or undervalued or whatever it is. But people just often forget about what a lot of architects do and like how much they contribute to society and what it would be like if we didn't exist and everything. I think that would
Mhm.
be one of the bigger ways to demonstrate it. It's like it's kind of the you never know what you have until it's gone in a way. I
Mhm.
think in order for people to really understand like how crucial good architecture is, the keyword being good architecture,
Mhm.
is if none of it existed, you would just have a lot of boring buildings out there. And of course people wouldn't care.
Yeah, 100%. It's bizarre to me. I feel like it's kind of like how we treat nature in a way when you walk in outside and you see a lot of like trees and stuff, you don't really realize that they're there, but they make your life better, they give you oxygen, they look
Mm,
beautiful, but then you don't think that way about a building. You just think like, oh, cool, or maybe like look at it for 5 seconds and you keep walking. But it's a whole art project that someone
yeah.
did and invested like years of their life potentially into, and I just think that deserves recognition.
No, that's perfectly said. So, last question, and then we'll move into our main topic. So, with your page, obviously you're very passionate about history, and you've made that very apparent on your page as well. In fact, some of your most viewed reels have come from architecture history. So, I wanted to know, when did you start to think about that as a concept for your page, or was it just like an inevitable thing where your passion just met social media and reels and Instagram and all that?
So I think it was just me being angry about some history concepts, and then I didn't really think a post would do it in a way. And so I was like, let me make this into a concise video with a long explanation that people can read and maybe relate to me or tell me that I'm wrong or explain to me why I shouldn't be uh, passionate or angry about it. And I think really the video that I made about the plan for Paris that Le Corbusier did, that in my opinion was
Yeah.
very interesting. Um, a lot of people had a lot to say about that, and I definitely learned a lot from that video and just sharing my opinion on the history of how that came about. And I think a lot of people just really resonate with being honest about architecture, if it's good, if it's bad, if it's
Mm.
complicated, and just really talking about it in that sense, which is why I think those really kind of blew up in the way that they did.
Yeah. Well, that's a perfect transition, actually, because speaking about whether architecture is good or not, we wanted
Hmm.
to open up our main topic for today, with some spicy takes, perhaps. So, one, we kind of have a general understanding just to set the context, right? We see that there's a pretty big discrepancy between where the general public sees architecture styles and how architects view architecture styles. And they may not be complete polar opposites, but there's definitely a little bit of a gap in between there, if not a pretty sizable gap. And when you really start to see that gap showcase is when you have the introduction of modern architecture compared to history. So I wanted to ask you your spicy take. What is your own take on architecture aesthetics? And I have an idea of where your answer is probably at, given you're a history buff. But do you lean more towards historical architecture, or do you like modern architecture, actually?
I think the spiciest take that I have is that I believe that architecture that is just has a cool shape or a cool form is going to die soon, and we don't really have an
Mm.
alternative to it right now. That's scary. I think we haven't really developed a style that is after the postmodern niche architect world that we've been living in for these past like 10 years, and just a building that is very interestingly shaped. I don't think it's gonna do much in the future for us.
Yeah, so all the crazy geometries, things like, are you talking more of works like Frank Gehry's and Zaha Hadid, or are you talking like those crazy, super like postmodern ones where it's literally a basket as a building, or both of those in the same category?
I think if you look at most of the projects that come out every year, a lot of them are really relying on the shape of the building or just the form of the building. And I just think
Mm.
that's not really sustainable, even from like an urbanist perspective. Like those look good if it's like on a mountain or on a hill or if it's like a big theater project. But if we're talking about like city planning and stuff, you can't really put like a weirdly shaped building into a city and make it look normal usually.
Yeah.
And I just think we have to come up with something new. I think there must be a new thing we can do except reinvent shapes all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. Something I want to get your opinion on then too, while we're at it, is in our history class, one of our professors would bring up this concept, or I guess, yeah, you could call it a concept, but it's an idea about pendulums, where as a society, trends tend to act like a pendulum, where they go
Hmm.
from one extreme and then they swing back to the other way, and then they swing back the other way, which is, you see this in expression based things about society, such as music, clothing, even, where
Hmm.
people are super obsessed with wearing clothes from like the 80s and the 70s and stuff right now because
Hmm.
the pendulum swung back. And then
Hmm.
pretty soon people are going to be like, well, this is kind of weird again. So we're going to go super far into the future maybe next. And, so I'm curious, what do you think about that for architecture? And then while you're saying that, the funky shapes of the buildings, do you think people are going to start to get bored of that and go back to very basic forms again?
Okay, so if we talk about the pendulum, I would say if this is like the middle of it, I think right now we've like swung
Hmm.
so far to the right that we're either gonna break it or we're just gonna like fully fly backwards. That's kind of where I see it as right now because we've been evolving so far into this direction of new technology and different shapes and new construction materials that I think we either have to now fully reinvent that or just go back to what we had before. And I think that also goes into what you asked, like, are we just going to go back to basic shaped buildings? I don't think so. I think we're going to have to evolve into something new because I don't think we can really go back with capitalism and the speed of the world and the construction that is happening right now. I don't think we really have a chance of even going back. That's the interesting thing about architecture with fashion. You can always like recreate those 80s looks and you can recreate those 60s outfits with the
Hmm.
new cheap materials. But with architecture, it's a little hard to do if you don't have any craftsmen or you don't have the means to finance it. So I think our only option is to kind of
Right.
break it and swing it. You know what I'm saying? Like, go somewhere else.
Well, I was going to say I'm pretty sure it was our brain break episode that we just did, but Albert and I were just talking about that pendulum concept, and we were thinking, rather than thinking of the pendulum of just staying in one place in history, what if the pendulum is always like moving forward or something, right?
Mm.
Thinking where we won't always swing all the way back to the beginning and all the way forward to the future. I think it's always like constantly moving just a little bit more. And part of me well, I don't want to get too ahead of the topic because we still have to talk about it in the video, or the podcast. But thinking about, I don't know if I think like what you're saying, I don't think we'll go all the way back to a certain point. I think we're always going to keep certain qualities of what we found from modern
Hmm.
architecture and just reintroduce stuff from the
Hmm.
past.
But I don't, how is it going to look? Because right now, I don't know if we have the means to. I don't even know if we have the time to. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it all happens so fast. Like, projects come and go, and
Right.
every month there's something new, and you have to come up with new ideas. How can we reintroduce those old things that we came up with.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Because, yeah, I mean, I wonder if, like, going to the history maybe of it then, right?
Mm,
The timeline of how we got to this part of our architecture history.
mm,
Back in the day, right? We're used to seeing these giant monuments of just, feats of human achievement, right? To the point where people were questioning if humans could even build a structure like that on their own. People like, did aliens build this thing? Because how did humans do it? There's
mm,
like all these crazy feats of human ability to do certain things, and a lot of it, I think, comes down to just back in the days, rulers and just the hierarchy of societies, whoever these rulers were basically able to tell anyone to do anything that they wanted to. So if they wanted their giant pyramid built, they would have a lot of people just do it without asking any questions, essentially. So you have all these people essentially, not really working for anything outside of just dedicating their lives to building this giant monumental structure.
mhm.
And if you think about it now, if someone said to do that, there'd be an uproar. Like nobody would ever stand for that, but, like rightfully so, because
Yes.
that's just crazy abusive working conditions and everything. So that is important to bring up just to show that our construction methods and our moralities for construction techniques have definitely improved. However, with that comes a different understanding of how far a budget can stretch for construction, because now you have to fairly pay people for their work when they're building your structures,
Hmm.
but that also means you're paying like well over whatever people were paying back in the days because they weren't getting paid. So when they were able to do these crazy things like St. Peter's Basilica and all that, or they had super talented people, they were basically told like, hey, you are like, your hands are ours, you're going to be working on all these thousands of column capitals and perfectly sculpting them for every single column that we have here, and if you don't do it, you're either going to jail or like worse. So it's kind of like a no-brainer where it's like, oh, no wonder they were able to do such beautiful things back in the days, because they were forced to.
Yeah, 100%. I think the way we got taught it is that there was kind of, instead of the three-class system that we have right now, so the rich, the middle class, and the poor, there was a fourth class, which was the artisan class, which I'm still really fascinated by the whole concept of that class. But those are basically people that
Hmm.
were a subgroup of the middle class that got paid fair amount of money, so livable wage that they could exist in the society that was previously just to make art and like dedicate their lives to making art. And those are the people that like also helped create the different ornaments on the, for example, the basilica that you mentioned. And I just think that today that artists and just people that create art like that would not be valued as much in order to actually make a livable wage from that and actually kind of contribute to architecture in that
Right.
sense. And I think the loss of our dedication to people that are actually skilled enough to do that is also why we're where we are right now with architecture a little bit.
I was gonna say, you brought up value, and I think that's a really good thing to build on with the history of how we got to our current architecture style. Because when I was doing some research for this, I didn't do a whole lot of deep dive research because I'm sure you would have a lot of opinions to bring up from your perspectives on
Mhm.
research too. And it's a lot of it comes surprisingly down to just like societal values, and you don't really think about it too much in current days until like you start to reflect back on history, and it shows more towards like the during like the Renaissance era. It was the most popular art has ever been in history, basically, where there's so much passion put towards it. The public loves expressing themselves with art pieces, with dedications to like their religious beliefs, and you have like these giant monuments to reflect that in history. You have hundreds and thousands of paintings that were done by like all these famous artists in the world, and you can see there's a clear value on art in that portion of society on the timeline. However, when things started to shift, I'll jump forward all the way to like the war era and everything, right? When all that was happening, like post war, there was now all of a sudden a very big value in society of saying we need to produce a lot of housing as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible. So no longer was there any, I guess, extra value spent on making sure that art was represented well. It was now, we just need things to be efficient, we need things to be done cheaply, and we need them to be done fast. So what came out of that? modern architecture, the Bauhaus movement, you know? How can you make these expressions in basically as little of a form as possible? So then when people make the meme about, oh, modern architecture is just a white box, it, yeah, I mean, it was basically plans to be that. I wanted to
Yeah.
get your take on that.
No, you took the words out of my mouth. It was, I think, for sure, the way we valued art before, we still value that same art that we used to value like 300 years ago. Like nothing has changed. We still think that the Renaissance buildings are the best, or we still think that the Renaissance art is the best, and nothing that we make today kind of compares to that. And I think the post-war era definitely plays a big role in that because, as you said, people suddenly it wasn't about the aesthetics. You didn't really have time to appreciate art. You had to survive. You had to create architecture where people could stay, like a lot of people in one place. It really wasn't about the aesthetics. And I think it became, sorry, and I think it went to a point where we started to make that our aesthetic. I think that's kind of where the international style came to be. We kind of had to make that minimalism that we created after the war be aesthetic, and then we kind of just stuck with it. And so far, the developments we've seen is either the postmodern rebellion against that with a bunch of different forms, or kind of where we are now, where we just use those shapes and the forms that we know from after the war era and try to make them look interesting with new materials. And I just think we have to find something else soon.
I was going to ask you about that too, the postmodern movement. I'm not very well versed in that portion of like architecture history and just that as an architecture style in general. Do you think you have a pretty general understanding of what postmodern is and, you know, A, why it was created, and two, why so many people hated it?
I don't think anybody's very well versed in postmodern movement just because of how hated it is, yes. But I can definitely give like a short rundown of it, I guess. So basically, it's what the name
Yeah,
says.
please.
So kind of the modern architecture was so omnipresent in everyone's lives that people were tired of it and they didn't know what to do with all the minimalism and all the form follows function and everything that the Bauhaus propaganda was kind of showing to all the people. And they were in a state where they couldn't go back to what they had before the war, again because of resources. And this is all happening in like the 80s and 90s, so like the political stuff, the climate wasn't very good back
Right.
then. So all they could do is just reject what they had in front of them. So basically, postmodern architecture is just a hardcore rejection of modern architecture in any sense that you can show it, which is why it's not a very clear style. Like you can't point at a building and be like, "This is definitely postmodern." You can
Yeah.
just say it's not modern, and if it's not modern, then it's probably postmodern.
Right.
But I think, yeah, it's just a whole rejection of what they had before.
Okay, yeah, no, that, I mean, honestly, pretty well executed definition. Yeah, that explains quite a bit. Because I wanted to ask you something about this too, and I was curious about how your school is teaching architecture styles. At K-State, I think there's a very strong emphasis in preaching for modern architecture as what I would consider to say like that's our default style. If you're designing any project, no one is surprised when the first thing you do is make something look like it's a modern building. To say that point from a different perspective, if you were to go out of your way to make it look more historical, I think a lot more professors would be like, "Hey, why are you doing that? Like that's not really like in the contemporary style of buildings and stuff." I don't know if they would outright hate on it, but it definitely would stand out and be like, "Hey, like why aren't you doing modern?" So I was curious if in Germany if they are in general tending to preach something along the same lines of like, "Oh, modern architecture is the default style."
Right. So it's a very good question actually, because in history, our professors are very non-biased when it comes to the style. So they actually just explain everything to us in the evolution that it happened. And then the design class, it's very separate from the history that we learn, because the way we are taught architecture, we kind of extract all our forms from the landscape or the buildings around the property that we want to build on, and it really has nothing to do with the styles or anything we learned in history class, which to me was very interesting. But yes, I definitely believe that people would look at me weird if I presented some like Gothic building to them on my final presentation. Nobody outright says that it's bad, but it's definitely something you would
Hmm.
have to explain a lot and probably couldn't, which is interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So I wanna stick on that for just a little bit longer to figure out what might be the cause of that. Like,
Mhm.
why do we think that there is? I don't want to use the word reject because that's a pretty strong word, but why
Mhm.
so many people are. Uh, let me rephrase it. Why do you think you have to justify with much more intensity of choosing a historical style to
Mhm.
use
Mhm.
instead of, like the default that we've been talking about, going for something more contemporary, if not futuristic in form and style and all that?
Mhm. I think the biggest part of it is because everyone hates historism, which was the style that we experienced in the 20th century and also the 19th century, where we kind of just tried to replicate Renaissance and Baroque buildings, and it all went horribly wrong, and it was just kind of lookalikes,
Hmm.
but didn't really represent anything. And I think that's what we're trying to avoid. And also, there's such a big push for
This
creating
is why we can't have
something.
nice things.
Yes, and also because we did it wrong when we could. Um, I think that's why there's such a big push for not doing those old buildings again, because we don't have a new foundation. And us as architecture students, we're the new generation of
Hmm.
architects. We're the people that going to create this new style that has to come soon. Again, the pendulum. Um, and us going back in time is kind of counterproductive to what the professors, I assume, and tutors would want to see from us and for the future of architecture. They want something new, probably.
So maybe it's more of the professors are trying to prep students to think more, look into the future and not look
Mhm.
towards the past to replicate it because it's already been done. They want to try and push for the
Yeah.
future and see, hey, what else can we create?
But the problem is there's
That's a good,
nothing
yeah.
in the
That's
future
a
yet.
that's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, but the problem is there's nothing in the future really yet to look at. Like you don't really know what you're doing, but you can.
Hmm.
That's why we kind of refer back to just working with the landscape and working with the buildings around the buildings that we want to make. But I think we are really missing that kind of style narrative that maybe other schools teach. I have no idea. That's a little that guidance, that foundation where you kind of get your ideas is a little lost, I think, right now.
So while we're on that then too, why do we think there's such a, again, generally speaking, but why do we think so many people in the world prefer historical buildings compared to modern architecture? And then it almost seems the opposite for architects, where
Hmm.
most architects actually prefer modern architecture in some capacities. So basing it on the fact that most architects nowadays are producing modern styles out of their offices today. To me, that shows that they favor modern architecture over historical architecture. So
Hmm.
I was interested to hear your opinion on why do you think the public loves history so much and despises modern architecture?
Well, I think first starting with why they love history so much, I think a lot of the ornate buildings often have ornaments that are very tactile and often show kind of scenes from people's lives or maybe things that they like. So I don't know if how the history buildings not history buildings. I don't know how the old buildings look where you live, but where I live, it's often like flowers or maybe people holding something or just vases or columns and stuff like that. And I think that human scale that is being given to the building and that humanization of it, if you will, is kind of what really draws people in. And also, I think a big part of it is nostalgia because all the movies we watch from when we were kids and the books we read, every time there was illustrations, it was the old buildings with like all the different ornaments and stuff. And I believe people just remember
Mm-hmm.
how good they felt when they used to watch that and they used to see that and see themselves in it. And right now, when they maybe look at a modern building, they can't really identify themselves the same way that they used to with the old buildings. The modern buildings, I think why a lot of people reject them or not understand them is because of the simplicity that a lot of them have. I think that people are kind of misunderstanding a lot of the new construction advancements that have happened in the industry post-war and post the Industrial Revolution. And if you're not a professional and you don't really understand how cool a material is or how cool it is to be able to have a building be shaped like a wave, you just look at it as, why is the roof so big? Like, we don't need this roof. Uh, and then and that kind of confusion and lack of knowledge just turns into people not liking it, and it kind of makes sense if you don't understand an art piece that you're looking at, like a modern art piece. Maybe it's just a black canvas or something, and you look at it and you have no idea what it means. An art nerd would be like, what are you talking about? This is great. But you, as someone who is used to looking at older paintings, would be like, what is this? I think it's kind of the same with architecture right
Yeah,
now.
that's a really good point. Yeah. Well, you were just talking about how someone who's in that industry and really understands the behind the scenes that makes something that you see look so simple, maybe that's why they're so fascinated by it, because they know all the intricate story behind it. They know the details that went into making it look so clean. They look at the accomplishments of just materiality and how you can accomplish such a massive span with no columns in it, compared to historical architecture where you needed columns pretty much like every 12 feet, it seems. So it was, that's a pretty interesting way to look at it, especially with the art comparison of, I think it comes down to the more you understand it, the more you can start to appreciate it, which makes me wonder too if that's why so many contemporary architecture firms really stress this idea of the narrative of projects. If you look at a lot of TED Talks, there's many architects that will go on and talk about not just the project in the building that they came up with, but why it was so important to this community that they were building it for. At least the really good architects will talk about that. And I think once the audience has that understanding of the project, then they start to really appreciate it a lot more, even though it's still in, that modern or contemporary style. So that's a very interesting perspective on that. So, because that kind of covers both bases then of like why architects tend to prefer modern styles, because they understand the accomplishments that are required to make it look the way that it does. And yeah, I think the one thing I wanted to go on further about that was the human scale of things. There was a TED Talk that I saw not too long ago. It was talking about needing to make buildings more human centered, or just on human scale, if you will, because that's a really good point. With a lot of modern buildings, especially the glass boxes that we call office buildings nowadays, it's horrible for feeling like you can belong in this space. You just look at this giant monolithic glass cube and it's hard to attach to something like that when it's literally just reflective and it just shows you nothing but the sky at some points. And there's just this horrible trend for quite a while. It seems like every single building, the default was just, okay, make it a funky form like what you were talking about and wrap it in glass or wrap it in GFRC or whatever material. And it's just like, is this really what we're trying to push for architecture right now? Like, for who are we doing this for? Are we doing this for the clients? Are we doing this as a statement of architecture? Are we, like, what is this glass building about? Because we've been doing this since the 50s, when Mies was coming out and he was just pushing for this glass and steel, and then concrete came into the mix not too far afterwards, and then it kind of just stuck there as an architecture movement, if you will.
No, 100% stuck there is a very good word. I have this joke that I say sometimes. Like in the Bauhaus, they had form follows function, and now it's kind of like function follows form almost. Because we have all these different
Yeah.
uh, different forms and shapes and glass buildings that look really cool from the outside, for architects or maybe for someone driving by, I don't know, for investors, but it's not very comfortable. As you said, there's definitely that humanness and the human scale often missing, especially in such big company buildings and big projects like that, for sure.
Yeah. I think one important thing to note too is we were again thinking about the history of how things have gone to this moment. It's really important to also study the economy just globally, but also just whatever the economy stated in the world is, also dictates how architecture goes across, which you don't necessarily think of those two things as being related to each other, but it couldn't be further from the truth. You know, we as architects, we rely on clients to have a lot of money to do these projects. And in order for those projects to be built, you also need to have contractors who can source these materials from people who are also selling it. So essentially, when the whole world is doing great, every industry in the AEC world is doing pretty great because most of the clients are making great money, so they can invest a lot more money into a project than they would if the economy is doing poor. And if they can put more budget into it, that means architects have a bit more room to play around with, more experimentation and more ability to look at things in a slightly more experimental way instead of going with the basics of like, oh, we're really crammed on our budget for this building, therefore we have to default to the cheapest materials possible. What is it? Okay, concrete, glass, some steel here and there, and like the cheapest of cheapest plywood and the cheapest of cheapest carpet and the, you know, fake materials to a certain degree in some parts. And when the economies are doing well, you almost start to see a little bit of the opposite, where buildings now start to get a bit more of those great, fun little toys for architects. So you get to play around with some funky forms, maybe, because that obviously comes with a lot more budget and structure and all this other stuff. So, what would you say about that?
No, definitely. I think architecture in general is a big reflection of how kind of the economic landscape is right now. I don't know about you guys, but in Germany, we're a little bit in a construction crisis right now, or the last couple of years maybe. So
Oh,
not a lot of investment into architecture and stuff like that. And generally, when there's not a lot of funds, the first thing that goes out the window is aesthetics and art, usually. And we're so tied to that as architects, it's kind
yeah.
of our whole being. That in a way, when the economy isn't really doing great, all we have left to do is kind of mass produce what we can, really, to try to like stay afloat and wait for those better days when we can do something amazing. And I definitely believe that if we could focus the funds on architecture, and if maybe there were more available funds for it, because often they're not, and there's more important stuff, um, we would have a lot of more progression when it comes to that, because the funds are very limited and they grow more limited every day, it seems like it. So if we could really expand that, it would definitely do something for the way we look at architecture and create architecture.
Yeah, no, totally. And I want to move on to these next 2 points that are pretty well related on that topic. I don't know about Germany specifically, but in the United States, there has become this infamous construction technique for developers for multifamily apartment buildings, you know, multifamily housing. They call them 5/1s, where it's like this style one construction at the bottom or type one construction at the bottom, followed by 5 floors usually, or a few floors above that of type 5 construction. And the whole reason for that is because one, it meets international building code. Two, it's probably the most efficient way, a budget friendly way to construct a building nowadays with the economy and the state that it is. So developers can develop those projects the most efficiently out of any other type that you can imagine. So it's no surprise that when you see new apartments going up, they all look the exact same, because they pretty much are all the exact same. It's literally the same formula with maybe a couple different aesthetics for the facade, and maybe
Why
that's
are
all
you
the architect
spilling the
gets to play
secrets?
with. But really, it's like the architect's hands are tied.
Don't tell
Yeah,
them that.
but it's like the architect's hands are tied with a lot of these things. So then it's a little frustrating, because it's like the general public who is tired of seeing these buildings are also the architects who are tired of making these projects, because it's like, look, we want to do cool things too, but we just can't because we don't have the budget to do it. And it's easy to point the fingers at the developers, but at the end of the day, they also have to make ends meet. They also have to make sure that they can turn some type of profit from this project. After all, they're not building it just out of the kindness of their hearts. That's just how like the business works. So there's a lot of these different factors that I don't think the general public thinks about go into a lot of the creation of these quote unquote ugly 5/1 apartment buildings everywhere. So I was curious, is Germany also in the same boat with that, where lots of 5/1s, or is there a different mass produced apartments type of a topology?
It's called something else, but there's a lot of kind of modular buildings that we have right now, which is just a bunch of
Mm,
different size modules that are being put together and then made into a building. And you can kind of build it very easily because it's a bunch of different size rooms that connect together in a easy way, and you can kind of construct it with these level forms that we use here in Germany. So that's definitely something that happens. And usually it is the same formula, surprisingly, that is just being made to look a little bit different with removing a module or maybe adding a corner window or I don't know, anything you
mm,
can do when you're on a tight budget. But yeah, basically the culture and art kind
right.
of goes out the window, as I said, when there is a tight budget and everyone suffers, and the public just doesn't really understand it, as you say, because we don't really talk about it. We just kind of keep it to ourselves and take the blame for when the building looks not interesting because we can't really say anything. We're
Mm,
responsible for designing it, even though there were so many other factors that played into it looking the way it
right.
does. You know what I'm saying?
So one other thing too I wanted to talk about is, are you familiar with brownstones as a typology? It's a specifically United States, more towards like I believe it was the 50s, but don't quote me on that. But the idea is they're like row houses or townhomes where they are like 3 story tall buildings. They're made out of this
Oh yeah,
what we
I
see nowadays and call it to be like very beautiful, brown stone. And it's a very characteristic aspect of a lot of New York City neighborhoods.
hmm
And nowadays people look to those and they absolutely love them, Like they would pay a premium just to live in those kind of neighborhoods. But then the thing that was funny when I was researching a thesis project of mine that was looking at different housing typologies is surprisingly people were not a fan of those buildings when they were first being introduced. Almost, or the funny part about it being, for basically the same reasons that people don't like 5/1s right now, where
hmm
it's the same thing every single time and it's just being mass produced and it's looking the exact same from every single building one to another. But then it's funny to think about that, where if we were to time travel back to then, you would be seeing people hating the very buildings that 50
hmm
years in the future that they actually go back to and they love and would pay
hmm
lots more money to live in. So, not saying this is going to happen, but I'd be very curious to see in like 20, 30 years or so if people are going to look back on these, crappy little 5/1 apartment buildings and be like, man, I love this building right here. I would pay so much money to live in this compared to
Wow.
whatever's going on in the future.
hmm The renaissance of the crappy buildings. That's so funny. No, definitely when if we just
I
build a
think that would be
lot
the title of this build or this episode.
but yeah, if we just build a lot of the same stuff and at some point it does become oversaturated. It's like when you listen to your favorite song on repeat, you get sick of it, but then 5 years later when you rediscover it, you're like, "Oh my God, this is the best song I've ever heard in my entire life. Why did I ever stop listening to it?"
Hmm.
But that's kind of what happens when you listen to it
Right.
on repeat and you look at it every single day. And then, but it doesn't make it a bad song. You just see it so much. It, it's just how we are as humans, I guess. But I didn't know about those brown buildings. It's definitely very interesting that you brought that up.
Yeah, I wish I had, maybe if I remember to, I'll try and put like a couple little captions of history that I can search up for it. But
hmm
I did this research quite a while ago, so I'll have to see if I can dig it up. But it was a very interesting realization when I was doing that research. I'm like, wow, who would have thought that people were disapproving of these buildings that people are raving for now? Like
hmm
that's kind of crazy. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you might know this better than I do, but wasn't the same approach done with Gothic architecture at the time? When Gothic architecture was first coming out into the scene, people were absolutely like
Yeah.
horrified by that. They're
Yes.
like, "Why are we like?" I don't remember this is the exact quote, but people were basically saying like it's the devil's architecture. Like
Yes. Yes.
in a in an era full of very religious people, they're like, "Why are we doing these giant, you know, monuments to God by building in the style of the devil?" It's very interesting to hear.
Mhm.
But then now we look at it from our perspective in 2024, and we're like, "What are you talking about? Gothic architecture is beautiful." Yeah.
No, totally. It's maybe when you first see it, kind of your first reaction can be a bit uh, almost wrong in a sense because you don't, you just kind of look at the building and you don't know how it's going to develop and how it's going to progress in time. But if you do look back at like the history of the buildings and where they came from, Oops.
I don't even remember what we were talking about.
Take two.
Gothic architecture. Yeah, take two. I think we were talking about Gothic architecture or something, and then everything went wrong.
It was the devil. It was the devil.
Yeah, but
I don't know.
yeah, I forget the point that we were trying to make on that. But I think we just move on to the next point, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about a lot of this episode already. So I want to make sure we hit on just a couple more things before the episode gets too long. And one of the specific things is I remember reaching out and asking you for some specific questions that you had. And one of them that was really interesting to me was, or a couple of the questions that you asked, which I wanted to get more of your clarification on. But you were saying something along the lines of like designs being a dynamic relationship rather than a static product. And I was wondering what you meant by that. If it was more of a like dynamic as in we can do renovations to it, or dynamic as in like the building itself is actually moving and changing and all this.
Okay, I see. To me, I think the way we kind of make buildings now is we design it and then we submit it, and then it's kind of like it stands there and we don't really touch it anymore as architects. Like we present it on our portfolios and stuff, but it's kind of there as it is. And that's kind of also what we do with other products, like when we sell stuff. Uh, I don't know, a t-shirt or something, we just sell it off and then it's gone, and then you ship it and then you forget about it. But I think the way that design should happen is it should always be a continuous dialogue between you and your work. Like you create something, you create a building, and then you look at it and then you say, oh, maybe this roof was a bad idea. Hopefully not if it's already a built building, but maybe if you're creating a model or something, I don't know. It should always be kind of this relationship you have with your work where you can go back and adjust. And maybe this relationship should even be expanded to the people that are going to live in the buildings. I know some companies already do that where they actually talk to the people that are going to live in the building they create. But to me, a good architecture design is a design that has a relationship with the people that are going to use it, and a design that has a relationship with the master, if you will, that created it, and not just something that they kind of shipped off and it's gone and out of the folder.
Yeah. No, that's a pretty interesting idea. I think there's also thinking about it more on the contract side of architecture. I think it's also fairly commonplace nowadays where certain clients will create these contracts with architecture firms where they agree to have one architect of record to continually go back to make updates to their building as they see fit. For example, airports do this quite frequently where they'll have one architect that they go to and say in 30 years they want to create a third terminal or something too, if they only have two or whatever it is. So that could be interesting to see as a industry trend further on in the future. If you could have architects basically come back and I don't know, like make like a software update to their buildings when the
Yeah.
style becomes irrelevant or something, or I don't know. That'd be kind of interesting
But
to
that also
see.
sounds stressful. I don't know
Yeah.
how that can really happen in the pace that we're moving in the industry
Right.
right now. If we slow down, it would be great, but I don't know if that's gonna happen in the near future with the way we're going.
I know, especially like in the future, everything just seems to be getting more efficient, faster, and cheaper. That's still what society seems to value the most right now.
Yeah.
And
And in the yeah. Sorry,
on
in the
that
end we're
note,
gonna
oh,
end up in a tent like we started.
yeah.
The cheapest form we can have.
Well, this made me remember back to the beginning of the episode. I think it was talking about artisanship, or yeah, artisanship and craftsmanship, and we can't really afford those things as much as we used to do in the days. And I'm wondering if, while that is true, I'm wondering if it's also just beginning to evolve in a different way that we may not realize. Something that I've been starting to pick up on, and not like I've invented this idea or anything, but the idea that 3D printers might be the new craftsmen of the future, where if you think about it now, right? Like I'll say a lot more schools have access to 3D printers and these new technologies that allow them to create these crazy forms that you just simply couldn't do by hand, or do it repeatedly by hand in the same way that craftsmen would have done in the past. Or push it even further, there are certain forms that you just literally cannot create by human hands. They're like these impossible shapes. So 3D printers can do it pretty much no problem. So that made me think about the way that the construction industry is starting to trend towards the future is smaller work crews and more technology reliance on things. They do this already for just scanning sites, BIM models that show you literally in like alternate reality holding an iPad on site, and it shows you to the millimeter where to place a bolt for this beam in like, crazy advancements, which is really exciting. But then the extra exciting part, at least for architects, is the ability to bring back ornamentation in a way that we simply can't do nowadays. And the most important part, doing it affordably, because you can have 3D printers use concrete and create these crazy forms. And you can have it do that repeatedly. Even prefabrication, right? You create molds and then pour the concrete into it, fills the mold, and now you just repeat that several times. So I'm wondering if, thinking as architecture students and their influence on the future of what architecture styles can become, I wonder if, very similar to the pendulum, like if you smash the middle again or whatever happens, I wonder if there is this new renaissance of trying to bring back some of these ornamentation aspects to architecture again, and being able to design those as the architects again.
I think that's such an interesting point, and I've never really thought about how we can use these new craftsmen, which I think is a very funny way to call 3D printers, like craftsmen, but it's a 3D printer. I think, no, that would honestly be the best case scenario, I believe, if we can kind of regain some of that culture and some of that art that we lost due to the war. With the new technologies that we have. However, I don't know how much the average developer wants to kind of deal with that, if you will.
Right.
So I don't know how many architects have the nerve to really get into that and do all the 3D printings of little shapes and stuff, if you will. However, if you do have the nerve, and if somehow it becomes so efficient that it doesn't cost you any mental brain cells during your workday that you're already losing all the time, I think it sounds like a great idea. I honestly never thought about it before you said it.
So on that note then, what would you think would be the next level of ornamentation? Because we talked about this a little bit earlier, but we were saying that it seems a little tacky or just out of place to want to replicate ornamentation details from the past and try to bring them into current architecture styles. So I'm curious of what you think the new ornamentation style could possibly look like, especially if 3D printers are going to be the ones to do it. Do you think that architects or architecture students would want to try and embrace that and say, look, now we can do these crazy geometric shapes because of how 3D printers operate and whatever else? Or do you think there will be a new a new wave of like historical motifs that come through and just like with a slight tweak to them or something?
Right. Well, I think as much as we talked about history, I don't really think it's going to come back like that fully. Maybe that is going to make some people sad and they're going to close this podcast right now. But I don't think it's going to come back in full force like that. But what I can see happening, and I already see a lot of experimentation with it at our university, is carvings on different materials. So a lot of people experiment with carving on glass or maybe drawing on like stone and stuff. Like even I tried it myself. We had this like stone wall on one of our projects, and then we kind of carved into it with a little hammer, like in the good old days. Probably a robot could do it better than me. But maybe something like that where the ornament is almost kind of part of the material, if you know what I'm saying. That would maybe be the next step, and that is definitely something that robots and 3D printers can do. They can definitely kind of adjust the outer layer of the material to be maybe a different look or something. So that's kind of my prediction, I guess.
Well, while we're on predictions, right, I wanted to ask you, what do you think in the current industry and with the current firms that are presenting work to, influence other industries and everything else, or influence other architects, Do you have a particular architect or set of architecture firms in your minds that you think are an example of what the future of architecture styles might hold? Because I have my own answer.
I'm curious to hear your answer.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think, in my opinion, as I said, I don't think there's really been a new kind of style or a new wave that has evolved right now. I think we're still kind of using what we know from the past 10 years and evolving it, which is also great. I'm not saying it's bad at all. But I think if I would have to pick a company that, in my opinion, really goes well with the time that we're in right now and kind of evolves, I would have to say that. For me, it would be Snøhetta. I don't know if you
Hmm.
know that company, but
Yes.
they've become really popular recently. But I've been interested in them for a while, and definitely their bigger projects, like the famous Beijing library that's been revealed recently. I think the way that they incorporate nature and environmental aspects and use that to not only make a shape but maybe make an impact on the world. I think, in my opinion, that really means a lot and could definitely be something that impacts the future trends that we hold.
Yeah, no, I had to I had to look it up on my phone again to remind myself what
hmm
the library
They
looks
have
like, and
these,
it's
it's so
crazy.
beautiful. It's
Yeah,
this glass built, and then inside of it, there's these columns, and they look like trees, and it all spans out
yeah.
to the top. And it's the biggest, like, climatized library in the world right now. And I just think they did an incredible job with it.
So I was curious, or if you can repeat again, like, what about it do you think was like does it have the influence for the future of it? Is
I,
it the form
Mhm.
aspect, or is it like trying to play on the fact that it's form and also something else?
I think it's everything but the form aspect. I think
Okay.
it's the environmental impact that they definitely considered while creating it. I think it's the new materials that they use. It's like the largest glass holding construction right now, currently, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it's the resemblance of nature and those forms that many
Mm,
people really like, kind of reimagined, not in a way which, like, they used to do in historism,
yeah.
but reimagined in a way that is beautiful and kind of has these, like, lily pads, as you said, on top with the columns inside. I think that is kind of really the way that we're going to go. And it doesn't really even matter what the outside form is. It's all about the experience and the different shapes inside that kind of hold the construction to me.
Yeah, so maybe more like biophilic or just like replicating nature as the next wave of architecture, which honestly, I think there's a lot of merit to that because, especially with the climate crisis and everything going on in the world, it's more relevant now than it ever has been to make sure that our buildings are, nature friendly and replicating a lot of aspects of nature that help regulate its own heat and cooling
hmm
and are able to capture water more efficiently and are able to use less resources for building, but also less resources when they're when they're maintaining the building and everything. So I definitely see that becoming like
hmm
another like the next wave of architecture movement and
hmm
just really experimenting on more like organic shapes possibly too.
hmm
And just especially with 3D printers able to do whatever shape that we want it to do,
hmm
that could be even more incredible. I was gonna say one of them that I was thinking about for like more of an influence on the next future of styles, or at least an adaptation to the current style, leading it more towards the future. Very similar to a pendulum, which is why I kept bringing it up, is an idea of keeping a lot of what we have currently liked from modern architecture, but people are tired of just the boring glass box. They want to see more ornamentation introduced into architecture again because that's what people feel more engaged to. It's more human scale,
hmm
like you were bringing up. And one of the firms that I think really does this well, not perfectly, but not like I think they're a very good example case of this, but it's Heatherwick Studios, where
hmm
they're very, very focused on the idea of craftsmanship in what I would call it the modern age, where
hmm
it's no longer just a concrete wall like what you would see a person do, or it's just smooth all the way around. They try to think of how can we add some extra depth to the profile of how we cast this concrete and what does that mean to the rest of the concept and how it impacts its users. And they even do that with like the shape of things. And they've done some crazy experimental work such as Pier 39 in New York City or Thousand Trees, which is kind of a weird one out there. It was very like experimental era, but it's interesting nonetheless to look at how they treat column capitals. It's no longer just a cylindrical column with a flat top and then that's it. They're like, how can we expand upon this idea? So they created giant tree pots with trees sticking out of the columns. It's like, yeah, no one would ever really think about that. They're just the purest of modern expression, you know? So to me, I think that's a very interesting firm to at least look at if you're trying to find some inspiration for, you know, what you could possibly do for your own studio projects and stuff for other listeners out there too. And one other one that I think is making a very prominent return is Art Deco. And you see this in a lot of newer projects, especially in Brooklyn and New York City and like the northeast area of the United States. Firms like Shop Architects with the Brooklyn Tower, that one has gotten a lot of recognition for like both good and bad reasons, but people have been really captivated by what they've done for the facade, which is bringing back these, it's not just a glass tower, it's now ornamented with certain profiles on the outside. So it's not just a glass box all the way around. There's certain parts they removed or specifically dedicated towards using like terracotta to make a return on that material and using brass for accents. They've done that too on the, I hope I'm saying the building right, but it's like 111 West 57 building. It's like this really, really tall one that's in the middle of Central Park, basically. And for that one, they've also kept a very strong emphasis on trying to pay homage to without replicating details of Art Deco that make it so prominent and so distinctive and what so many people love about it, but bringing in aspects of modern architecture that we like so much, such as larger windows. I don't think we'll ever go back to a period of time where we're using smaller windows. So they're keeping that relevant to their new Art Deco style, and they're trying to bring back ornamentation. So the things that people can find details in the building that make them love it so much, and trying to make those details on human scale so you can relate to whatever's going on. It doesn't feel like this monolithic thing. So that, at least more in like a superficial way, I guess you could say, is what I think a bigger trend of architecture is moving towards. But I really like your input about the whole biophilic idea of architecture is pretty much just going to start to replicate nature soon too. So I wonder if we'll actually start to see two or more styles being present in architecture. Because when you think about history, and again, you can talk on this better than I can probably, but there really never seemed to be competing architecture styles, right? It almost seemed like there was just one agreed upon style and everyone just did that.
Yes, architecture has never been as international as it is now and as accessible as it is now to kind of seek inspiration. So we have all these different people emerging with different styles for sure. And I think in the future it's just going to get more with the competition rising and maybe like all the economic stuff that's happening right now. We're definitely something's going to happen if it's biophilic or if it's the Art Deco resurgence that you talked about. I think we're definitely going to see some competition for sure.
Yeah. Well, shoot, we've covered a lot. It's been a pretty long episode. I think this is a pretty good point to start to wrap things up. I'm assuming you're aware of our whole final takeaways and everything for the episodes. I was curious if you would want to lead us in that.
Well, I think the final takeaway we can have from this episode is to remember the roots of the industry that you're in and understand how we can move forward and not just design blindly. I think that would be my take from this episode. And just be creative and not stuck in the same place that you were.
Yeah, I think I will add on to that for my final takeaway and just advocate for future technologies. I was mentioning a little bit earlier, but the idea of now that we have these advancements of 3D printers, and you were bringing up the fact that you can carve into materials with computers now, like CNC machines, and thinking about while you're designing your projects in studio, you know, what can you really do nowadays that we couldn't have done in the past with the aid of these new technologies and even new materials, because there's new materials being introduced every year now. So I think my biggest advocate for that is just like, do your research on materials and see what you can possibly do that has never been done before, or like using different technologies, how can you make these things done in a way that no one's ever done before? And you're not even like starting on the first wave. There's been so many architects that are leading the industry that are already trying to do these things. So like research up on that and like try to figure out what you think you can take from them and try to stand on their shoulders and try and do something even better from it. So
Yeah. And
the
definitely
school
don't
is the time to experiment, right? That's what everyone says.
and definitely don't let the limitations that the industry has now kind of limit your idea of what architecture can be. I think that's also a very important thing to
That's a
say.
good point too. Yeah. Oh shoot. Okay. Well, thank you guys for watching this episode of the podcast, and thank you so much, Maria, for being on. Genuinely, I was really excited to record this episode, and I think you've added so much great value to this conversation.
Thank you so much. It was an honor being here, and you guys do a great job. I'm very excited to listen.
Thank you. And by the way, is there anything in particular that you wanted to plug, or where can people find you and follow you for more content?
Well, I'm mostly on my Instagram, so it's my full name, Maria Ulashchenko. I hope it's going to be somewhere on the screen.
Oh, of course, yes.
And then
We'll put it in the description for sure.
Yeah. And then underscore architecture. That's where you find me if you want to hear more nerdy stuff. And I also have like a TikTok and stuff, but it's mostly Instagram right now.
Awesome, yeah. And then otherwise, if you guys wanted to hear more episodes, especially on the Architecturally Speaking, we had our last Architecturally Speaking with Korai, so definitely check out that episode. We'll have a link in the description for that as well. But otherwise, again, as always, just comment and try to engage with us. What did we leave out? What did we not see while we were recording this? Let us know your comments on why you think people are interested or uninterested in modern architecture. And let us know what you think is going to be the next trend. And we'll just try to have a dialogue as much as we can. So other than that, that's pretty much everything. So thanks for checking us out, and don't forget to save.